Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. My name is Sharonda Williams, the Communications Specialist of the National Center for Primary Care. The Southeast Addiction Technology Transfer Center and the Substance Use and Prevention Division of the National Center for Primary Care welcome you to the Power of the Faith Community in SUD treatment. In compliance with ACCME guidelines, the following speakers have no financial or other relationships with the manufacturers of any commercial services discussed in this educational activity. About SATTC, the 2017-2022 ATTC network is comprised of one network coordinating office, 10 domestic regional centers, 6 international HIV centers, PEPFAR funded. Established in 1993 by SAMHSA, the domestic ATTCs accelerate the adoption and implementation of evidence-based and promising addiction treatment and recovery-oriented practices and services, heighten the awareness, knowledge, and the skills of the workforce that addresses the needs of people with substance use and/or behavioral health disorders, and foster regional and national alliances among culturally diverse practitioners, researchers, policymakers, funders, and the recovery community. Without further ado, I would love to welcome our speaker, Mr. James Campbell, and let him take over our presentation at the time. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. I really appreciate you taking the time today to learn a little bit about the power of the faith community and substance use disorder treatment. This is a conversation that is really important to me personally. I'm both a licensed professional counselor, a licensed addiction counselor, and am ordained as a minister as well. And so I wear multiple hats, and I can tell you for sure that is the only time I use that introduction in that way would be for this particular webinar. I do hope that you'll find the time today useful and it'll be beneficial and things that you're able to take back and use in a practical way as well. We do have some objectives for today in terms of what we hope to accomplish in this next roughly 45 minutes or so. One of those is that you'll be provided with information regarding the prevalence of substance use disorders in the general population. To get a sense of that in numeric terms, we often hear words like opioid epidemic or marijuana tsunami and things like that thrown around. But the reality is, we want to get an idea of what that really means for us in a local sense as well. We want to enhance the understanding of both points of tension as well as common themes of the faith and treatment and recovery communities. We know that there are some of both. There are places that can be snags for us when interacting on the faith community and the treatment and/or recovery community sides of things. But there's also a lot of really good common ground where we can really build some positive supports and communication as well. We also want to explore potential ways the faith community helps to meet the needs of individuals with substance use disorders. That will not be an exhaustive discussion because there are so many ways that the faith community is really beneficial and positive in that regard. But we do want to make sure to at least acknowledge some of those common ones and ways that we might be able to work well together. Uh, to move forward, we want to start with some foundational agreements. Uh, for one, I'd like to pose that as a question. How many of you would say that you disagree with someone in your faith community regarding something that you believe? I think if we were saying a show of hands, everybody's hand would probably be up. If you're part of a faith community, even people who you are aligned with in terms of your core beliefs, there will still be things that are not points of contention necessarily, but places where you don't exactly see eye to eye. You may not agree 100% on some finer point of doctrine or theory or theology, and that's really important to acknowledge up front. We won't always agree 100%. As a second question, how many of you would say that you disagree with someone in your work community regarding something that you believe? Uh, Once again, I think for all of us, the answer would be yes. Whether that is a disagreement about something that is really core and critical to what we do or how we go about doing it, or something as simple as what the thermostat is set on, there's always going to be points of disagreement. Anytime there are points of disagreement or two different points of view, there's the potential there for that tension to grow. And so to give us a little grace to hopefully help grease the gears a little bit today, I would also like to ask this question. Can we approach our time together today with humility enough to listen, compassion enough to express views with kindness and respect? I think if we can do that, then everything else will be able to work out in the long run. Just to come from a point of knowing that I don't have all the answers, and I don't anticipate that anyone on the call will, but that we can grow forward together and that we can learn together in that regard. So, why are we having this conversation? Why do a webinar related to the faith community and substance use disorders? Well, according to the National Institutes of Health, it's estimated that 1 in 10 individuals will struggle with a non-alcohol substance use disorder at some point in their lifetime. In other words, a substance use disorder that is not in any way related to alcohol. And 1 in 3 will develop an alcohol use disorder at some point in their lives. That is a substantial portion of our population, just in terms of the general population. That means that if you have a place of worship or a congregation of 100 people or so, on average, between 30 to 40 are going to struggle with a substance use disorder at some point throughout the course of their lifetime. That number may be a slightly less because we do know that having a faith community is a protective factor. But if you are in the faith community, you already know that that number is certainly pronounced. It is a high percentage. That's why we have this conversation today as well. Additionally, often faith leaders are approached about life issues and concerns before anyone else is. There are a great number of people before they would ever go talk to a private counselor or addictions counselor or anyone like that. They would be much more apt to go and talk to someone in their faith community, whether that's a pastor or a priest or a rabbi or imam or someone along those lines. They're much more likely to go and talk to someone in the faith community rather than in the treatment community. That is both a strength and can be a challenge as well, as we'll discuss a little bit throughout the course of our time today. Although faith leaders can provide tremendous support and do, they're often overextended. They have more on their plate than they can handle. In fact, I've never seen anybody on the treatment side or in the faith community who is sitting around trying to figure out what to do with their free time. Uh, Folks in the faith communities and in the treatment communities are incredibly busy. They have a lot to do, more than they can get done in any given day. Also, we want to be certain that members of the faith community are operating within their scope of practice. What I mean by that is we want to be very careful that if I'm not a physician, that I'm not giving medical advice. A for instance would be, say someone in the faith community has someone approach them and says, you know, I'm thinking about doing buprenorphine. I've been on it before, or I've been on it for a while. Should I discontinue, or should I not do this medication? In the event that faith leader decides to say, you should definitely discontinue that immediately, just pray more. And heaven forbid the person have a recurrence and use again, the end result could be an overdose and even a death. And if that occurs, that holds some liability for the person in the faith community. So we want to be really certain that we're operating within our scope of practice in that regard. And religious and or spiritual involvement predict less use of and fewer problems with alcohol, tobacco, and illicit drugs. And in other words, it is a protective factor. It is important. Engagement in a faith community doesn't mean someone is immune to a substance use disorder, but it does mean that they're less likely to use it to excess, and are less likely to develop a substance use disorder itself. There are also, however, some challenges that we face. When interacting with both the faith community and the therapeutic community or the treatment community, there are certain biases that exist on both sides of that equation. Earlier, I said that I never give the introduction of I'm a licensed professional counselor and a licensed addiction counselor and a minister, because there's almost never a population I'm speaking to where it's okay to be both equally. That can be a little bit of a challenge as well. Church leaders often see psychology as a godless religion, and sometimes they view mutual support groups as a substitute for the faith community. Now, there's a long history there that goes back in terms of why some of that is. Although we know that the 12-step fellowship actually grew out of a faith community of the Oxford group. There's a lot of common ground there. Uh, but at the point when the shift is made to speak of a higher power or things of that nature, sometimes the church or religious and faith communities really struggle with that language a little bit. They see it as a little generic, that sort of thing. Um, Also, if you have an option between going to, say, a church meeting or a faith meeting on a Wednesday night or going to a 12-step fellowship meeting, it is somewhat of a competition just in terms of hours in a day and where one invests those hours. So that can be a challenge for folks on the faith side of the equation. On the other hand, the treatment community often views the faith community as having ulterior motives beyond helping others. At times, they even equate some types of religiosity with psychopathology. Um, in the case of having ulterior motives, the question sometimes arises is are they here to proselytize or evangelize? Are they here to try to convert people over to their way of seeing things, their faith, their religion? That can be a place where a lot of folks have concern. Likewise, they may wonder if they're having some religious delusions in some case and things of that nature. So there is sometimes a bit of tension that exists between those two sides of the equation. Um, my goal today isn't to try to ignore those or to deny that those tensions exist. It's really to take a look at a path forward to work through those tensions so that we can really be a more effective support to one another. Treatment and mutual support groups are often more open to addressing spirituality than many other areas of human services. That's actually a real benefit. Just like there are challenges, there are places where we're actually more designed, more structured to be able to work well together than many other treatment modalities, many other diagnoses, and things of that nature may be. We know that within treatment mutual support, addressing spirituality is a part of what we do, is a part of our common language. And so, in that regard, we're really open to the faith community being involved and being engaged. Likewise, I find that treatment and mutual support groups need more resources than they have to serve people who are hurting and struggling. I mentioned before that people on the treatment side of the equation are likewise not trying to figure out what to do with free time. They're very busy. They're often overextended. And to give some sense of things, it's estimated that only about 1 in 10 individuals who would benefit from treatment for substance use disorders ever come to any type of a treatment facility. What that means is that 90% of people who could benefit from treatment for substance use disorders never grace the doors of any facility. That means that those 90% are out there in the community, often connecting in faith communities, connecting in civic communities and civic groups, in the workplace. That need is really pronounced, it's really significant. And if that 90% were to show up at a treatment facility, it would be completely overwhelmed. What that means is in terms of treatment, we have to approach things with a sense of humility. We need the faith community's help. We need that connection and that interconnectedness in order to serve those that we care about most effectively. We also often agree that spirituality is a fundamental aspect of sustainable recovery. There's definitely a spiritual dynamic at play in terms of the recovery process. And just about every faith or every recovery community that I know of really emphasizes spirituality as a key aspect of what they're focusing on, what they're trying to cultivate, and what they're aiming for. Now, the faith community also often has significantly more demands on their time than they can meet. Uh, Again, I mentioned earlier that tendency is to be overwhelmed, to feel like you have to be everything to everyone. But the reality is that if you're already doing multiple ministries or multiple meetings and multiple ways of serving those who are part of your faith community, it's going to be really difficult for you to also then meet the needs of those who have a substance use disorder. That likewise is going to be a challenge. So, just in terms of hours in a day, likewise, there are times where it can be really beneficial to those in the faith community to make referrals to treatment or to the recovery community as well. The faith community is also often willing to direct those in their community to community resources and or professional staff on matters of medical treatment in areas beyond their expertise. If someone came to me tomorrow and said, do you have an opinion on whether or not I should continue my glucophage for diabetes? I would not speak to that. I'm not a physician. I don't have an informed opinion on it, and as such, I wouldn't offer my advice in any kind of a medical sense. Likewise, I think that most folks in the faith community understand that as well. They understand that there is a medical component involved. Absolutely. There's a physiological aspect. And we want to make sure that we're being wise and careful in regards to where we make referrals or what we try to handle in house. Um, but I find that folks in the faith community are open to making those connections. They just don't always know where to turn, they don't always know where the resources are. The faith community is also more aligned with treatment and recovery principles than they may realize. There is really a tremendous amount of common ground that we share in terms of what we try to do to help others. That can include things such as benevolence, the desire to do good by other people. Likewise, non malfeasance, we're not trying to do harm to anyone. Those are things that we share. We have a desire to see decreased suffering and other things that we'll comment on a bit later on in this session. It's also important to note that religious teachings include teachings about substance use. Those aren't mutually exclusive. The faith community has things to say about uh, whether or not a person should use substances at all, alcohol and other drugs, or whether they should use them to excess, or where and when they should be used. It does vary quite a bit in terms of the particular faith community that one belongs to. An example is in the Judeo-Christian sacraments involve wine on occasion. That can be a challenge for some. Now, in the southeastern United States, that may take the form of Welch's grape juice or some form thereof. But the reality is that traditionally wine was what was used for communion or the Eucharist and at certain celebrations in the Jewish heritage and in Judaism. So, in that regards, if you're a person who's in recovery for alcohol or who struggles with alcoholism or alcohol use disorder, then that's going to be a challenge for you when it comes time to take communion. If you want to be a part of that, how do you join in some places can be a challenge for the person who is a member of a faith community and also seeking to be in recovery. Likewise, in the Jewish and the Christian traditions, the the text denounces drunkenness. In other words, although it may use alcohol in terms of a sacrament, it denounces the overuse of alcohol, and it doesn't in any way condone drunkenness. It calls strong drink a mocker and things of that nature as well. Islam, on the other hand, strictly prohibits the use of alcohol and drugs across the board pretty unilaterally. It is more stringent in that regard, which is a distinction between those two faiths. And those certainly aren't the only ones in the world. For instance, Native American traditions, Polynesian, African religions have used hallucinogens and other substances to enhance spiritual transcendence. They actually incorporate those things into their faith practices, whether that is involves peyote or whether that may involve tobacco in a peace pipe or any number of things. There's certainly a tradition of utilizing substances in order to access spirituality. We can talk a bit more about that as we go as well. There are many common themes that we share in the treatment community as well as in the faith community. These are things that we have that are common ground, a place where we can begin to navigate a path forward together and look at things that we share in common. Number one is that both the treatment and faith communities have a desire to alleviate the suffering of others. We don't want to see people hurting. We don't want to see people sick. We don't want to see people being less than their best. In those regards, we really share that in common. That's something that we can really come together and agree upon. Additionally, we have a desire to demonstrate love and compassion. Now, we may use different language to talk about that. You might call that loving your neighbor in a faith tradition, and you may talk about unconditional positive regard on the treatment side of things. But Unconditional positive regard sounds an awful lot like agape love or love for all of humanity. So there's certainly some commonality there as well. We want to love, support, and care for those who come into our sphere of influence. We also share an understanding of the need for support and community. We have a word for people in recovery by themselves. We call it high. You don't do recovery by yourself. You need a community to do that. Likewise, we need a connection in terms of our faith community. We grow best with others. And so, in that regard, we both acknowledge that need to not forsake our assembling together, to really deliberately, intentionally spend time together is important to both of those. We also get that progress and growth are both ongoing. That what that means is that none of us have arrived. None of us have it all together, have reached perfection. That we're not there. We're all works in progress. We can celebrate incremental change together. That we're not perfect, but we are better than we once were, and that we're moving forward to being better still. Those are things that we generally share in common as well. Another point that is important in considering the treatment and the faith communities is that what those we serve believe really does make a practical difference. And part of that means knowing what those we serve do believe. For instance, over 90% of Americans believe in God or report a belief in a higher power. That's 9 out of 10 people who we interact with at any given time in the treatment community have a belief in a higher power and a God. Additionally, 57% engage in daily prayer. That means that the belief in God is not just a passive belief, but it is one where the individual is seeking to engage, to have communication with, to petition toward their higher power. That's pretty significant as well. 42% attended church or religious services in the last week. Now, again, this specific study was 93, so it's got a little age on it, but those numbers haven't shifted dramatically over time. They're still pretty consistent. That is, again, a substantial portion of the population uh, who is reaching out to the faith community, has a belief in a higher power, is seeking communication therewith. And these are also the folks who often make their ways to the doors of treatment facilities as well. What they believe really does matter. 80% of those surveyed believe that religious faith can aid in recovery from illness. Now, there's also some good research and science out there that indicates that's accurate, that a belief in a higher power, prayer, and faith can actually improve health outcomes across the board for medical illnesses and medical maladies. Uh, that 80% having a belief that their religious faith can aid in recovery carries over into recovery from substance use disorders as well, since substance use disorders likewise are a medical issue, a medical disease. So, in that regard, that belief is really important as well. 63% agree that doctors should talk to them about spiritual issues. So not only is there an anticipation that their faith can make a difference in their recovery from illness, they actually want their caregivers, not just counselors, but even physicians, to have those conversations about spiritual issues with them. They believe that there's a mandate, if you will, to have conversations about spiritual issues with those that we care for. That's a significant finding as well. So, in other words, if you are a treatment provider who happens to be listening to this, those who are coming to you anticipate that you will engage with them regarding their spirituality and their beliefs, not to proselytize, evangelize, and convert in any way, but to really explore with them what their faith looks like, what their spirituality looks like, and to really help them incorporate their beliefs into their recovery. One distinction that is really important to make here, and I think that is really fundamental to having conversations with those we serve about spirituality, is the distinction between religion and spirit. Those really are two distinct and differing terms, and they have different roles. I also want to be very careful to point out that it's not like one is the good guy and the other is the bad guy. It's not that one is good, one is bad. They're just different and distinct. In terms of religion, it literally comes from the root word religio, or obligation, duty, or rule. That is a very distinct delineation in terms of what that means. What are we obliged to do? What are the rules that we should be following dutifully? Is a part of that. It tells us how to live. What are the things that we should be doing? How should we be carrying out our affairs? Likewise, what constitutes a righteous life? Like, what is right? What is wrong? What is righteousness? What does that look like? What do we need to do in order to be right? It also usually involves laws or mandates. For instance, it's the Ten Commandments, not the Ten Suggestions, or even in terms of the law of karma. Whatever faith you come from, there's usually some very clear delineations about what one should and should not be doing, how one should be living their life. Those usually traditionally also come from a specific text of some kind, a religious text of some sort as well. And this won't come as a surprise to anyone, but religion is often divisive. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that if you are sitting around the dinner table and you want to create some tension, start bringing up specific thoughts about a religious belief or religious doctrine or what a person ought to be doing religiously, and you will make your Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah meal taste not so great as it might otherwise have. So religion can be very divisive in terms of what one believes. Even as we said before, if you're with people who share the core fundamental beliefs, if you get out aside from those core beliefs much, you will find a lot of disagreement there in terms of what one believes or what one believes about how their religious and faith should be carried out. On the other hand, spirituality is a different root word altogether, where religion comes from religio, duty, obligation, rules. Spirituality comes from spiritus, which means breath or breathing. Again, that is a very important distinction between those two things. You may have a choice to make about whether or not you're going to follow through on obligations, whether you're going to obey a law or not obey a law, or whether you're going to be religious or irreligious, whether you're going to hold any belief system. You can choose to be religious or not. With regards to spirituality, you only have so much choice about whether or not you're going to breathe. In fact, if you are not breathing and you are on this webinar, I encourage you to quickly get off and dial 911 as quickly as you can. Breathing, spirit is a part of life, and in short, it's sort of the essence of life. Uh, if you are not breathing, you don't sustain life for any length of time. So it's really imperative, it's core to who we are as human beings. It's part of what gives life its meaning. Uh, we also know that some people are deeply religious, but may not be particularly spiritual. To be completely frank, I know people who are parts of faith community who are sometimes some of the most unpleasant and unloving people I've known in my lifetime. I've also met some of the most compassionate, loving, generous, gracious human beings I've ever met there. So they're not mutually exclusive. They're just also not synonymous. I've likewise known people who are deeply spiritual people who were not particularly religious. They were incredibly gracious, incredibly loving, very connected to the people around them, and very engaged in the lives of those folks. Spirituality, in that sense, is part of what gives human life its unique meaning. That doesn't mean that animals, for instance, don't have spirit in them. Clearly, there is something alive within them as well. Uh, but they don't experience spirituality in the same way that human beings do. They don't have the capacity to time travel that our brains allow us to look back into the past and consider our traditions, or to look ahead to the future and determine where we want to go and set an intention. They lack that sort of a capacity. So, in that regard, spirituality is uniquely human in that capacity of expression, in terms of how we carry that out. And in that way, it is very connecting. We may not agree at all on every belief that we have, every point of doctrine we believe or don't believe, but we can be deeply connected in the sense that we are all part of a common humanity. We all do have a spirituality to us and a spirit about us. So, in light of that, how do we begin to collaborate to help one another and others a bit more effectively? How can we really serve one another well, and how can we serve those that we care about well? First, I think knowing what resources are in the community is key. Um, for instance, if someone comes to you with a question about uh, medically assisted treatment or medically appropriate treatment for opioids, uh, would you even know where to refer them to be assessed for that? Would you know what resources are available for that? That's really important. Likewise, on the treatment side of things, do you know uh, which faith communities have support groups related to substance use disorders where people can really be transparent and open and not judged and things of that nature? Knowing what resources are there is really pivotal and key and crucial in terms of being able to make effective referrals. It also keeps us from referring to places where someone's not going to be well served. For instance, there are some mutual support groups where if you are using anything other than alcohol, you would not be welcome to talk about that in that particular meeting. In traditional Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, for instance, if you came in and started talking about benzodiazepines or cocaine or something like that, that's not usually well received in a traditional AA meeting. There are certainly others that have changed a bit on that over time. Likewise, there are now many meetings such as Celebrate Recovery, on one hand, things of that nature, which really are positive supports. They have a positive community where people can come together, can be open about their struggles, which can be a really significant strength and support for many as well. Knowing what those resources are helps us be more effective, whether we're in the faith community referring to treatment or whether we're in the treatment side of things referring to the faith community. Likewise, clarifying roles and expectations is really important. Um, I learned years ago in terms of just relationships that it's not really fair to hold people responsible for expectations that I've never expressed. Likewise, that is very much true when we're collaborating together between the faith communities and the treatment communities. We need to be really clear about what kind of support is okay and where we are, what kind of support is not okay where we are, what kind of a program it is, what is useful and what is not useful in terms of engagement, what is most helpful to those that we serve in a given environment. And just like we wouldn't anticipate someone um, from a opioid treatment center to come in and start talking about buprenorphine from a pulpit or from an altar somewhere, we without having cleared that with the pastor or without the priest or without the rabbi or etc. Likewise, we would not anticipate someone from the faith community to come into a group room and to begin to share their belief system as well. So knowing that up front to clarify those expectations can really save a lot of tension and disagreement on the back end. Likewise, focusing on shared goals is really important to really help both sides understand that we may not agree 100% on everything in terms of how we go about it, but at heart, we're all trying to help people. We're all trying to help those who are struggling with an active substance use disorder to make their way to a vibrant, sustainable recovery and to move forward in that way. When we have that shared capacity, to me, in my experience, the remedy for division is a significant, large enough vision. To have a vision that is big enough is unifying, even when we may have some differences in how we carry that out. And that we support one another is huge. And what that means is that when the person who is part of the faith community comes and shares or cares for somebody in a treatment facility in some way, that when they leave, we don't in any way roll our eyes or go, oh, well, that's those people over there. And vice versa, that folks in the faith community aren't going, well, oh, those secular folks, those treatment people don't know like we know. Basically, that we're being supportive of each other and the different roles that we play. Um, the reality is that since we are both so overextended, uh, to somehow diminish the support that another group can offer is really, really foolish in a way. We want to be sure that we're really honoring the support that each can give and provide to those who we care for to really help meet the needs to the best of both of our abilities. And finally, to treat all we serve and all we serve alongside with the utmost care, respect, and compassion. Uh, we all get tired and we all have off days. We all get it wrong sometimes. And what that means is when we get it wrong, that we just admit to that. When we make a mistake, to say so. And likewise, to really be diligent and deliberate in supporting and lifting up one another. The services that one provides. It's fine to say, this may not be a fit for everyone, but this is a great support to many. So why don't you give that a chance? Why don't you go see if that's helpful or beneficial? That can really go a long way toward helping those in our care to really make the connections that they're going to need long term. That's also really important on the treatment side of things because the reality is a severe substance use disorder is a chronic disease. And what that means is that at best in treatment, we are treating a chronic disease in an acute setting. What that means is that if we are not deliberately building collaboration and community support, we're doing a disservice to those in our care. We know that they're going to need supports throughout the course of their lifetime, and treatment will not always be it. So we have an obligation to really honor, come alongside, have care, respect, and compassion for those in the faith community as well, and really build one another up rather than tearing one another down. Um, Now, as I prepare to close out, I already have a few questions that have posted along the way. The contact information that is there before I go into a little bit of Q&A uh, is my accurate current information. It's there for a very deliberate reason. What I know also is within both the faith and the treatment communities, there tends to be a tendency toward, physician heal yourself. We are very good at talking about self care, and we are very bad at practicing self care ourselves. And so, in that capacity, we need each other too. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to be the therapist to everyone who is on this webinar, nor would that be necessarily be a fit for everyone on this webinar. What that does mean, though, is that the more connected we can be, the more we're going to look like the recovery that we try to foster instead of the isolation of the disease that we say we're here to treat. We need to collaborate, we need to be connected, and we need to be coordinating with one another in that way. So that is my contact information currently as well. Now to move on and to do a bit of Q&A, a bit of question and answer as well. One question that was posed was, how can faith communities be culturally competent and reflective in their response to substance use disorders? I think that's first of all, an excellent question. How do we seek to be culturally competent as a part of a faith community? I think the beginning of wisdom there for me was a phrase I came across some years ago that said, "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." The reality is that it's wonderful that you have answers to your questions in terms of your faith, but understanding that not everyone has the same questions as you or may have the same answers as you is very important. And likewise, if we begin out of the gate by talking about religion, which we've already talked about can be divisive, we will often lose or alienate those who we're trying to serve and engage with. Um, what that means is that we really need to listen first before we start speaking, or as Covey said, that we will uh, seek to understand first before being understood. To really know what the challenges are that the people that we serve face is really important and critical. I find when I come to people out of a place of cultural humility and willing to listen and learn, that actually my influence with them goes up. They're more willing to hear out the things that I have to say. I think that's true for both the treatment side and for the faith community side. Likewise, I see often on the treatment side of the equation, um, folks show up at our doorstep, and the very first thing we start talking about is change playmates and playgrounds. Well, if I just met you and the first thing you tell me is you need to cut your friends loose and quit going the places that you go, although that may be wonderful advice, the reality is I'm probably not going to take it because I don't have any relationship with you yet. So that's really important to consider as well. A second question that I came across is, can you articulate how you measure success with your interventions? I think that is likewise a very relevant discussion currently. Uh, Now, part of that, I will say, comes down to whether you're working as a part of a program and what the stance is of that particular program. For instance, there are some programs that are very focused on complete abstinence from all substances. Uh, that is certainly within their rights to believe, and that's certainly within their rights to move forward. But others don't define recovery in the same way. For instance, is the last formal program I worked with was an adolescent treatment facility, residential for males. And what success was defined for in that environment was that the person abstained from substances and met 75% of their treatment goals. Well, that may not be a fit at all if you're part of a faith community. Um, some things that I think are really important there is to acknowledge that it is a chronic disease, which means that recurrence or relapse does frequently happen. It doesn't always happen, it's not a prerequisite. And recurrence or relapse is also not part of recovery. It's part of the disease of addiction or the disease of substance use disorder. That's an important distinction as well. So that doesn't mean that if someone does use after a period of having not used, that somehow their recovery is lesser. In fact, one of the things we know is that the more time someone engages in treatment and the more time someone engages in the recovery process, the more likely they are to have a sustained recovery. Not surprisingly, the more times you try something, the more likely you are to get to being successful in that. I also say it's important to know how the individual defines success to really help them define that for themselves. Even if at some point they decide to be completely abstinent from all substances, they may not start there in the beginning. In that regard, for me and for myself, I want to see people consistently moving further away from substance use disorder and the symptoms thereof and more toward a full, rich, engaged life of recovery. To me, that's my bottom line, and that means incremental changes. That means I celebrate when they cut down what they used. Would I would I celebrate if they completely ceased using? Of course I would. Um, but the reality is that that person may not be completely there just yet. So it's important to make that distinction. The next question I have is how to engage faith leaders to collaborate with substance use providers. Uh, I find that there are a few things there. One is I think you have to let people know what the needs are. Often, individuals in the faith community may not know what the needs you may have are. They may not know that you need uh, someone to come in and do a voluntary faith-based group or something like that. They may not know that you have physical needs in your program that they could help meet. So making sure that we let the individuals in the faith community know what the needs are is important in that regard. It's very difficult for people to meet needs they don't know exist. So being deliberate in that is important as well. But I've found that when people in the faith community are aware of the needs and they get the capacity that they have to really help care for people, help alleviate suffering, that they really are willing to get engaged. That can look a lot of different ways, and there are some considerations in that. For instance, if you lead that voluntary faith-based group, it's important that it is voluntary, particularly if you're receiving any state or federal dollars. Anything that is faith-oriented is going to have to be voluntary and not mandated typically. So that's really important to keep in mind. But I found that in programs I've worked in the past, I've had people who came in and did a voluntary Bible study or a voluntary faith meeting or faith group meeting. I've had people who, one of the greatest allies we ever had at that adolescent residential program that I alluded to earlier, was a gentleman who was a pastor at a church literally like 50 yards from where we were. And they were phenomenal. They would do things like come in and they would host a cookout for the young men and their families where they would literally prepare the food, show up, serve, and engage with the families, show love and care and concern for them in that way, which was huge and made a significant impact on the people that we served. Um, they also were at times people who came to us in that program uh, who literally came to us with the clothes on their back. That was all they had. They may have come to us from another facility, from jail or detention. And when that happened, they often didn't have resources in terms of their ability to go out to buy things. And so there were times where the faith community would come alongside us and literally meet those physical needs. And that might be through a clothes closet, that might be through uh, gift certificates to a retail store. They did it in a great many ways, but they really did a phenomenal job in really engaging us as well. On the other side of that, one way to let people know about the needs that you have uh, can be through going and speaking at various congregations or faith communities throughout your community as well, to really share with them what you're doing, what is the work about, what are you trying to achieve, who are the people that you're there to serve. The more people understand that we aren't working with diagnoses, we're working with human beings who happen to have a diagnosis. That's huge as well, and that can make a significant difference. You also may do that through social media, through shares and likes and things of that nature as well, by posting your needs to some kind of a public forum. All of those can be good ways to really help engage as well. The next question that I have is how is MAT being integrated into faith-based provision of recovery support? Um, there are some places where that occurs. I think the key is that uh, if it's an MAT program, they're going to have the right credentials to be able to provide that service. You're going to have a physician. They sometimes have to have a specific type of number to prescribe certain medications. And so, in that regard, there can't just be a faith program that says we're going to start administering medications without taking some deliberate steps to get there. Um, that said, MAT can certainly benefit from faith community connecting as well. One that's local in my area, for instance, partners with some of the faith communities in meeting needs for families at the holidays and things of that nature, which can be significant. They also, if they know of material needs, they really can be a help there. Even if it's not meeting that need themselves, sometimes it's knowing who in the community to refer to as far as uh, help with food or help with having heating bill paid in full or in part, some of those sorts of things. I also say it's important for people in the faith community to understand that MAT isn't just substituting one drug for another. That there really is some good research and good science about the effectiveness and the efficacy of MAT. And that there are things that are a little unique and distinct. If someone's dose isn't quite right, they may seem tired and groggy. I'll also add here that if you are working in a faith community or in a faith-based program, where you do serve people who are on MAT, it's probably a really good idea for you to have naloxone on hand. That is the overdose reversal medication. Uh, that people have that on hand and that they know how to use it, because in the event someone comes into your services or comes into your program and they overdose, you want to be sure you know how to meet that need. That's really important as well. So again, it really comes down to being knowledgeable about resources, to making sure that we have the right credentials in order to be able to make good recommendations, and that we're operating within our scope of practice, but that we likewise can still be a tremendous support for one another. Um, the last question I see right now, before we close out, is that they would like to hear about work being done with adolescents. Um, uh, there is actually tremendous work happening right now in the terms of adolescent services in many places. Uh, that looks like a lot of different things. That can be the outpatient setting where someone's just coming in for a group and is living at home or living in their community. Uh, that can also be in-home services where people are going and providing services to the family within their residence or apartment or wherever they happen to live. That's important as well. And traditional residential programs are still very much alive and well, and have great capacity for many to make a significant difference as well. But in addition to those formal treatment modalities, I'm personally incredibly excited about some of the things happening in terms of young people in recovery. There's a tremendous amount of work being done now in terms of collegiate recovery, everything from sober housing to true recovery programs on college campuses. There are recovery high schools that are actually up and running where folks who have substance use disorders and are looking for a supportive environment for recovery can attend that high school. Even up to just having supports within a traditional educational setting as well. Within the community, having true young people recovery meetings. And I say true because in my area for years, it was that if you said you were going to a young people's meeting, that meant someone around 30 to 35 was probably being the chair of that meeting. Well, I promise you, if you're a 15-year-old and you walk in, that does not feel like a young people's meeting. So that in that regard, there's a lot of good things happening in terms of truly youth-led recovery in a community sense as well. One other resource I would mention there that is a national one. So there's a great deal of differences in how this carries out places, but it's Faces and Voices of Recovery. They have done a lot of good work in terms of connecting people to resources in their communities as well, and can really do a lot in terms of gearing people towards services that are appropriate and helpful in many places. So that will bring us to the conclusion of the question portion of what I have. I really do appreciate you taking the time to be on this webinar today. I hope that you found some things useful. And in closing, I will just share this from my own faith tradition. In my own faith tradition, there's a story that goes as follows. That there was a man who was living in a perfect garden, and it was a perfect garden, a perfect environment, and he was in perfect relationship with God. And in the midst of all that perfection, there was something that was considered not good. And the first thing that was ever considered not good wasn't sin, and it wasn't fruit, and it wasn't any of that other stuff that sometimes gets thrown into the mix. In my own tradition, what is taught is the very first thing ever called not good was for man to dwell alone. We need each other. And in that regard, the more we can collaborate and come together, both individually, with our families, with our communities, and between the treatment facilities, the recovery community, and the faith community, the better it's going to be for everyone who we serve, as well as for ourselves. With that said, thank you so much for spending the time with me today. I hope to hear good comments in the days to come, and I hope to hear from each of you. Take care, and thank you.